Ever notice how some people look like adults but act like they skipped a few chapters in growing up? Emotional immaturity isn't about age, it's about behavior, and it can sneak into relationships, friendships, and even work. Today, we're breaking down the top 3 signs that someone hasn't quite leveled up emotionally, and trust me, once you see them, you can't unsee them. They avoid accountability and always find a way to shift the blame, and this shows up in so many subtle ways that you almost miss it until it becomes a pattern you can't ignore. It's the person who makes a mistake at work but quickly says they only did it because someone didn't give them the right instructions, or the friend who forgets to meet you for lunch and insists it's because you didn't remind them. They use excuses like a shield, not because the situation truly wasn't their fault, but because taking responsibility would mean facing discomfort. And discomfort for them is like holding a hot coal. They can't keep it in their hands long enough to learn from it, so they toss it at someone else as fast as possible. The moment they feel they're under a spotlight, they start pointing fingers, and this habit protects their ego in the short term, but costs them trust in the long term. People around them start to notice that whenever something goes wrong, somehow it's never their fault, and that pattern slowly eats away at credibility and respect. You see, accountability requires emotional strength, and emotional immaturity thrives on avoiding anything that might bruise the self-image. When you can own a mistake, you're saying, I'm secure enough to admit I'm not perfect, but when someone can't, they're revealing that their sense of self is too fragile to handle any cracks in the armor. So instead of looking inward, they turn their gaze outward, hunting for the nearest scapegoat. And it's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's delivered with a laugh or a, well, you know how so and so is kind of comment. But underneath, it's the same habit of dodging responsibility. Over time, this avoidance becomes muscle memory. When something goes wrong, their instinct isn't, how did I contribute to this? But how fast can I get the target off my back? Another way this shows up is in their language. Listen closely to the words they use when things go wrong, and you'll notice a pattern of distancing themselves from the situation. They'll say things like, this happened, instead of, I did this, or that's just the way it turned out, instead of, I could have handled that better. These subtle language choices keep them from feeling ownership, which means they also miss the opportunity to grow from the experience. And because they rarely self-reflect, they tend to repeat the same mistakes again and again, each time with a fresh batch of justifications ready to go. It's not just about not wanting to be wrong, it's about protecting a fragile identity that feels safer living in denial than facing the truth. And this pattern also impacts relationships. People who constantly shift blame create an environment where others feel like they have to walk on eggshells, because if you point out something they did wrong, they won't meet you with understanding. They'll meet you with deflection. Maybe they'll accuse you of being too sensitive, or they'll dredge up something you did months ago to balance the scales, making sure they never have to fully own their role in the present issue. It turns every conflict into a competition for who can prove the other person is more at fault. And when blame shifting becomes the default mode of operation, it slowly erodes intimacy, because real connection can't survive without accountability. In professional settings, this behavior can be even more damaging. Teams rely on trust, and trust comes from knowing that if someone drops the ball, they'll raise their hand and say, that's on me. When a person can't do that, it creates a culture of finger pointing where everyone's energy is spent defending themselves instead of solving problems. Projects get delayed, morale drops, and the person avoiding responsibility often convinces themselves they're just being misunderstood, not realizing they've built a reputation for unreliability. And because they see themselves as the victim, they feel even more justified in pushing blame onto others, creating a self-reinforcing loop. The root of this avoidance often comes down to fear: fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. Taking responsibility means acknowledging that you made a poor choice or didn't perform as well as you could have. And for someone who equates mistakes with personal failure, that's terrifying. So they create a narrative that protects them from that fear, even if it's not rooted in reality. The problem is that these narratives keep them stuck, because if nothing is ever truly their fault, then nothing ever changes. You can't grow from lessons you never let yourself learn. And you can't build resilience without facing the discomfort of owning your actions. It's important to remember that avoiding accountability doesn't always come from malicious intent. Sometimes it's a learned survival tactic. Maybe they grew up in an environment where admitting fault meant punishment or humiliation, so they learned to protect themselves by shifting the spotlight. But what protects you as a child can hold you back as an adult. Growth requires letting go of those old habits and developing the courage to say, that was me, I could have done better, without letting that admission define your worth. The challenge is that for someone emotionally immature, that leap feels too big, so they stay in the comfort zone of blame, never realizing it's actually the thing keeping them from moving forward. They struggle to handle conflict without blowing up, shutting down, or running away, and this reaction can turn even the smallest disagreement into a full-blown standoff. Conflict is a normal part of life, but for someone emotionally immature, it feels like an attack on their identity rather than an opportunity to solve a problem. The moment tension arises, their emotions take the driver's seat and rational thinking gets pushed to the back. Instead of listening, they might raise their voice, interrupt, or throw out accusations that have nothing to do with the current issue. On the opposite end, they might completely shut down, refusing to speak or engage because it feels safer to withdraw than risk being hurt. Then there's the third option, running away altogether, either by physically leaving the room or emotionally checking out until the conversation is over. These responses might relieve their immediate discomfort, but they leave the conflict unresolved, creating a cycle where the same issues keep coming back. When someone's default is to blow up in conflict, the goal shifts from finding a solution to simply winning the argument or making the other person back down. The problem is, once emotions boil over, it's hard to pull them back, and what started as a small disagreement can quickly turn personal. Words get thrown out in anger, and even if apologies come later, the damage lingers. People begin to associate bringing up concerns with the risk of triggering an outburst, so they avoid addressing problems altogether, which only allows resentment to grow. Shutting down has a different but equally harmful impact. It leaves the other person feeling dismissed and unheard. Silence may seem like it's keeping the peace, but it actually builds walls between people, creating distance that's hard to close later. And when avoidance becomes the go-to move, small problems have the space to grow into much larger ones. Running away from conflict is another common pattern. This doesn't always mean physically storming out. Sometimes it's changing the subject, cracking a joke, or pretending nothing happened. In the moment, it feels like they're keeping things light, but in reality, they're avoiding the deeper conversation that needs to happen. The underlying message is, I don't want to deal with this, which leaves the other person holding all the emotional weight. Over time, this kind of behavior chips away at trust because relationships are built on the ability to work through challenges together. If one person consistently avoids those challenges, the other is left to either carry the load alone or stop bringing issues up entirely. Both paths weaken the connection. The inability to handle conflict in a healthy way often comes from a lack of emotional regulation. If someone hasn't learned to pause, breathe, and process their feelings before responding, their reactions will always be driven by impulse rather than intention. This makes them unpredictable, and unpredictability makes it hard for others to feel safe expressing themselves. Even in professional settings, these patterns can cause tension. A colleague who blows up in meetings creates an environment where people are hesitant to speak openly. A teammate who shuts down leaves projects stalled because important discussions never happen. And someone who avoids difficult conversations altogether allows small errors or misunderstandings to snowball into major setbacks. Many times, people who struggle with conflict grew up in environments where disagreements were either explosive or non-existent. Maybe they learned that raising their voice was the only way to be heard, or they learned that staying silent was the safest way to avoid trouble. Those coping mechanisms may have worked in the past, but in adult relationships, they become barriers to healthy communication. True conflict resolution requires being able to stay engaged without letting emotions take over, to listen without immediately defending, and to respond without retaliating. But for the emotionally immature, the discomfort of sitting in that tension feels unbearable. so they reach for the reactions they know best: fight, freeze, or flee. The ripple effects of this behavior are easy to spot. Friends and partners start to self-censor to avoid triggering a blow-up. Workplace conversations get watered down because no one wants to risk the shutdown. Even personal growth is stalled because conflict, when handled well, is one of the fastest ways to build understanding and trust. Without it, relationships stay surface level, problems remain unresolved, and frustration quietly builds until it bursts in unhealthy ways. And while it might seem easier in the moment to avoid the heat of disagreement, that avoidance comes at the cost of long-term connection and stability. In the end, struggling with conflict isn't about the conflict itself. It's about the fear of what it might mean. If someone equates disagreement with rejection, they'll react in ways designed to protect themselves from feeling exposed or wrong. Blowing up forces others to back off. Shutting down creates distance so they don't have to be vulnerable. Running away means they never have to face the discomfort of working through the hard parts. These reactions may protect them in the short term, but they prevent the very growth, understanding, and trust that would make future conflicts easier to navigate. They can't regulate emotions and expect others to manage their moods for them, and this creates a constant push and pull dynamic in their relationships where people around them feel responsible for keeping them calm, happy, or satisfied. Emotional regulation is the ability to notice a feeling, process it, and respond in a way that's intentional rather than reactive. But for someone emotionally immature, feelings tend to run the show. If they're angry, everyone else has to tiptoe around them. If they're sad, they expect others to cheer them up. If they're stressed, they want others to carry the weight so they don't have to deal with it themselves. This isn't about leaning on loved ones for support in healthy ways. It's about relying on them to do the emotional heavy lifting every time, which can quickly drain even the most patient person. The unspoken message they send is, "Your job is to keep me okay." And when that becomes the unspoken rule, relationships turn into emotional caretaking rather than mutual connection. This expectation often shows up in subtle ways. It might be the friend who sulks through an evening out because something earlier in the day upset them, waiting for everyone to notice and fix it. Or the coworker who snaps at people when they're stressed, assuming others will just understand and adjust their behavior accordingly. Sometimes it's the partner who uses silent treatment as a way to signal they're upset, forcing the other person to guess what went wrong and make the first move to repair things. In all these cases, the responsibility for managing the feeling gets shifted away from the person experiencing it and onto the people around them. Over time, this dynamic creates resentment because no one wants to feel like they're constantly on call for someone else's emotional state. When you can't regulate your own emotions, your reactions tend to be amplified, and small inconveniences can feel like personal attacks. A delayed text feels like rejection. A disagreement feels like betrayal. A bad day at work becomes a reason to snap at everyone at home. Because these reactions are so intense, the person often feels justified in their behavior, telling themselves, "I wouldn't be acting this way if you hadn't done that." In reality, the trigger might be external, but the reaction is entirely within their control. They just haven't built the skills to handle it. Instead of pausing to process what they're feeling, they offload it, hoping someone else will smooth it over. The expectation that others should manage their moods often comes from never having learned how to sit with discomfort. If frustration builds, they need someone to talk them down immediately. If sadness hits, they need someone to distract or reassure them. And while support is important in any relationship, emotional maturity means you can self-soothe first, then reach out for help if needed. Without that ability, every bump in the road feels like a crisis that requires someone else's intervention. This creates an imbalance where one person becomes the perpetual comforter and the other becomes the perpetual comfort seeker, leaving little room for equality in the relationship. In workplace settings, this pattern can be just as disruptive. A team member who can't regulate their emotions might derail meetings with visible frustration, shut down when challenged, or dominate group energy with their stress. Others end up adjusting their communication styles just to avoid setting them off, which reduces efficiency and stifles honest discussion. Over time, people may stop giving them feedback altogether because the cost of their reaction is too high. This doesn't just hurt the team, it also hurts the person because without honest input, they lose opportunities to grow. Often, this struggle ties back to childhood experiences where emotions were either dismissed or overindulged. Maybe they were taught that every strong feeling should be immediately fixed by someone else. Or maybe they were never given the tools to work through emotions independently. Whatever the cause, the result is the same: an adult who believes that when they feel bad, someone else should make it better. But real emotional strength is built by learning how to name the feeling, understand where it's coming from, and choose a response that aligns with your values rather than your impulses. Without this skill, emotions remain in control, and everyone else is expected to follow their lead. The challenge is that while relying on others to manage your moods can provide short-term relief, it erodes relationships over time. Friends, partners, and coworkers begin to feel drained, not because they don't care, but because they're constantly giving without receiving the same effort in return. Emotional regulation isn't about being perfect or never needing support. It's about taking responsibility for your own inner world so you can approach others from a place of balance rather than dependence. When someone hasn't developed that skill, they live in a constant state of emotional outsourcing, never realizing that the very control they're looking for starts with them. They constantly put their needs first without considering the impact on others, and while at times it can look like confidence or self-assuredness, it's actually rooted in a narrow focus that makes them blind to the bigger picture of how their actions affect the people around them. In conversations, they might steer everything back to their own experiences, rarely asking questions or showing curiosity about someone else's perspective. In group decisions, they'll push for what benefits them the most, even if it means others have to compromise far more than they do. This isn't the same as healthy self-prioritization. It's an automatic habit of measuring every choice by how it serves them personally, with little regard for whether it creates extra work, stress, or disappointment for someone else. Over time, this one-way focus creates tension because the people in their life start to feel unseen, undervalued, and like their own needs will never take priority. You'll often notice this pattern in how they respond to shared responsibilities. If there's a task that's inconvenient or unappealing, they'll subtly find ways to avoid it, assuming someone else will handle it without complaint. In friendships or relationships, they might expect others to be flexible for them, but resist doing the same in return. If they're running late, they'll expect you to wait patiently, but if you're late, they'll make it a bigger issue. In the moment, these choices might seem small, but they stack up and create a clear picture. They're willing to take more than they give. This imbalance can leave the other person feeling like they're always bending to make things work, while the emotionally immature person rarely makes sacrifices unless there's something in it for them. Sometimes this self-first approach shows up in more subtle emotional ways. In conversations, they might quickly change the topic when it's not about them, or minimize someone else's challenges by comparing them to their own. If a friend shares they're going through something difficult, the emotionally immature person might respond by explaining how their own situation is harder, redirecting the focus and sympathy toward themselves. They may not even be aware they're doing it because their default setting is to center their own emotions and experiences. This isn't just inconsiderate. It signals a lack of emotional awareness that makes genuine empathy difficult. In workplace settings, this trait can lead to behavior that undermines collaboration. They might take credit for team successes, but distance themselves from failures or lobby for assignments that put them in the spotlight while leaving less visible but equally important tasks to others. If a project deadline conflicts with their personal plans, they may expect the schedule to shift around them without acknowledging the inconvenience it causes the rest of the team. These patterns quickly erode trust and make colleagues hesitant to rely on them because there's always the risk that they'll prioritize their own benefit over the group's needs. The root of constantly putting themselves first can sometimes be traced to environments where they had to fight for their own needs to be met, leading to a mindset that if they don't look out for themselves, no one else will. While self-advocacy is healthy, the inability to balance it with consideration for others creates a dynamic where relationships feel transactional. People begin to sense that the emotionally immature person's support or cooperation is conditional. It's there when it's convenient for them, but fades when it requires genuine compromise. Over time, those around them may stop offering support altogether, knowing it's unlikely to be reciprocated. What makes this behavior particularly damaging is that it often goes unnoticed by the person doing it. They might see themselves as independent, efficient, or simply knowing what they want, without realizing that their version of independence is actually dependence on others picking up the slack. They may tell themselves they're just being honest or realistic when they prioritize their needs, but without an equal willingness to consider others, this mindset leaves a trail of frustration and resentment in their relationships. Emotional maturity isn't about putting others first all the time. It's about knowing when to compromise, when to listen, and when to make space for someone else's needs to matter just as much as your own. Over time, the cost of always putting themselves first is that they end up surrounded by people who no longer trust their intentions. Friends stop asking for help because they know it won't be a priority. Coworkers avoid relying on them for important tasks. Even family members may pull back emotionally, recognizing that their needs will always take second place. The emotionally immature person may view this withdrawal as others being cold or distant, without realizing it's a direct result of their own one-sided approach. And until they learn that relationships thrive on balance and mutual respect, they'll continue to confuse self-interest with self-respect, not understanding that one can exist without harming the other. They resist growth and keep repeating the same mistakes, expecting different results, and this habit becomes one of the clearest signs that someone is stuck in emotional immaturity. Growth requires reflection, a willingness to be uncomfortable, and an openness to changing behaviors that aren't working. But for them, those steps feel too risky or too much work. They might say they want things to be better, but when it comes time to make adjustments, they default back to familiar patterns because that's where they feel safest. Even when faced with the same negative outcome over and over, they'll rationalize it away instead of asking themselves what needs to change. This might look like repeatedly choosing the same type of unhealthy relationship and wondering why it always ends badly, or handling conflicts at work with the same defensive tone and being surprised when it strains professional connections again. Instead of seeing the common denominator in these situations, they focus on blaming external factors, missing the opportunity to grow. Part of this resistance comes from the comfort of routine, even when the routine is harmful. Change feels uncertain, and uncertainty can trigger fear. For someone emotionally immature, that fear outweighs the potential benefits of growth, so they cling to what they know, even if it keeps leading them into the same problems. They may even defend their behavior by saying things like, "That's just the way I am," or "People should accept me for me," as if acknowledging the need for change would somehow mean losing their identity. The truth is, real maturity means being able to adapt without feeling like you're betraying yourself, but that flexibility requires emotional security they haven't developed yet. When someone resists growth, feedback becomes another thing to avoid. Instead of taking constructive criticism as a chance to improve, they treat it like an attack. This often leads them to surround themselves with people who won't challenge them, creating an echo chamber that reinforces their existing habits. In the short term, this might protect their ego, but in the long run, it limits their ability to see blind spots or develop new skills. The result is a kind of self-imposed stagnation where years go by, but their behavior, mindset, and emotional responses stay exactly the same. This stagnation doesn't just affect their own progress, it impacts the people around them, especially in close relationships where one person's refusal to grow can hold both people back. You can often spot this pattern by noticing how they react to repeated challenges. If a similar problem comes up multiple times, do they approach it differently or do they use the exact same approach that failed before? For the emotionally immature, the answer is usually the latter. They may not even realize they're repeating themselves because they don't pause long enough to analyze what went wrong. This lack of self-awareness means lessons that could have been learned get wasted, and instead of moving forward, they end up in a frustrating loop. Over time, this loop becomes part of their identity, and they may start believing they're just unlucky or always misunderstood, when in reality, they're avoiding the very changes that would break the cycle. In professional settings, this resistance can become a major obstacle. A person who doesn't grow will keep making the same errors, missing deadlines, or clashing with colleagues in predictable ways. Because they're not adapting, their reputation suffers and opportunities pass them by. They might view this as being overlooked or undervalued without realizing that the issue is their unwillingness to evolve. The same applies in personal life. Relationships with someone who refuses to grow can feel stuck, like no matter how much time passes or how many conversations happen, nothing truly changes. This creates frustration for partners, friends, and family who may eventually pull back because they've stopped believing that progress is possible. The fear of change often masks itself as confidence or stubbornness. They might say they're just sticking to their principles, but in reality, it's about avoiding vulnerability. Growth means admitting you don't have it all figured out, and for someone emotionally immature, that admission can feel like failure. So they double down on old habits even when those habits cost them opportunities, relationships, and peace of mind. Ironically, this refusal to change is exactly what keeps them in the situations they're trying to avoid, creating a cycle of frustration that reinforces their belief that life is just unfair to them. What makes this pattern so damaging is that the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to break. Every repeated mistake reinforces the idea that this is just how things are, and the more entrenched that mindset becomes, the more resistance they feel toward trying something new. People around them may start to withdraw, tired of offering advice or support that goes ignored. Eventually, the emotionally immature person is left wondering why things never improve, without realizing that the missing ingredient is their own willingness to step outside of their comfort zone. Until that shift happens, they'll keep walking the same path, hitting the same walls, and wondering why the view never changes.